So thank you, Alexandro. As you mentioned, I'm working in Brussels, and I'm here now in Brussels. Unfortunately, I will have to leave around 4:30 because I have a flight to take to go to the Baltic area, where we are also talking about urban wastewater and the implementation of this directive. On the next slide, you will see that, as you mentioned, it's an old directive. It was adopted in 1991. And so we were thinking that it's time to reform and to review this directive. I don't know if you can pass this next slide. But yes, so the first thing is that we were thinking what was good and what was not working in this directive. And it was really our main angle for thinking about, before reviewing this directive, to make an in-depth evaluation. And we did this in-depth evaluation. In fact, the initial directive in 1991 was very simple. It's a directive saying that member states have to collect and to treat their wastewater coming from the big cities, and they have to monitor and report what is happening in the wastewater. The lesson that we have learned from this directive is that it is a really, really working directive. It's an effective tool. It has tangible impacts. You can really see the improvement of the rivers, the seas, the lakes in the European Union thanks through this directive. There was a before and an after 1991, as there will be a before and an after 2024. But it's clear that this directive has a really good effect, and it's mainly because it's quite simple and a target. So member states know exactly what they have to do, and the Commission can use its tool to follow and track how this directive is applied. For our friends in Latin America, in fact, we are making directive in Brussels, and the member states have to transpose this directive in their national legislation. But then after, the Commission is in charge to make sure that this directive is implemented. And we have launched a lot of infringement cases, which some of them go to the European Court of Justice with fines for the member states which are late. So there is a kind of carrot and stick approach, because at the same time, the European Union has mobilized a lot of European funds. Every year, about 2 billion euros are provided by the European Union to the member states for water infrastructure. So at the same time, we have the possibilities to have an infringement approach, but also these funds were in place. And by the way, they were adopted in 1981 when Spain was joining the European Union. And when Spain joined the European Union, this directive was really a point of discussion because the financing was important. And then these structural funds and cohesion funds were created at that time, particularly for the water infrastructure. Another lesson is that the benefits are much higher than the cost. Another lesson is that there is room for improvement. Clearly, there is remaining pollution, and I will come back in details because on each action we have tackled this remaining pollution. Eutrophication remains a big issue, notably in, for instance, in the Baltic Sea, but also in some area in the Adriatic Sea, and also in some rivers, in several rivers and lakes. In fact, this sector is also using a lot of energy and creating a lot of greenhouse gas emission. At the end, it's only 1% of the total emissions or energy use, but it could be zero. And so the room for improvement is quite important there as well. Also, we are losing a lot of resource by bad sludge management. Last but not least, I would like to mention that this sector in the European Union is mainly a public sector, and even if there are private companies, you don't have the choice of your operator. So it's a captive market, and it's really important to ensure transparency in this sector because citizens have no choice of their operator. Well, that's the main lesson of the evaluation. On the next slides, I will immediately jump on what is new in this directive. The first thing that was really important for us is the stormwater overflow. I don't know if you can pass the next slide. Stormwater overflow are important because, in fact, today we have made a lot of efforts to capture the pollution when there is no rain. But in fact, when there are rains and the rains regime is changing in the European Union, where you have big rains, suddenly you have massive amount of pollution going directly to the rivers. And that creates a lot of disturbance of the ecosystem. And we find it sad that, in a sense, all the effort that we are doing for the non-rain wastewater treatment and collection are jeopardized by the lack of action on rainwater. So it was a difficult aspect to tackle, because the solution must be local and must be discovered at local level. So at European level, we have just put a kind of frame requiring to the big cities to have an integrated plan for their water management. Often in several countries, it's already in place, but not everywhere, with an objective to reduce pollution to a maximum of 2% of the usual pollution. But the actual solution must be discovered at local level. We have just listed a kind of hierarchy of action, starting by prevention. So more green space, more retention of water in the cities, an optimization of the existing infrastructure. All that should be considered before considering new infrastructure like new reservoir or things like that. On the small agglomeration, they remain a big source of pollution. Around 10% of the wastewater, urban wastewater pollution is coming from the small agglomeration. There we have imposed an extension of the scope of the directive to 1,000 inhabitants. For the time being, it's 2,000, and it has decreased from 2,000 to 1,000. That will be progressively applied to all countries, and it was a difficult discussion in the Council and the Parliament, but at the end, there were time derogation for those countries having difficulties with this measure. A last point which is important is that the directive allows for individual system. But the problem is that these individual systems are not standardized, neither harmonized at European level. So here we will have a mandate for the Commission to develop new standards for the individual system, so that we are sure that these individual systems are delivering a kind of treatment which is similar to the one which is in the big wastewater treatment plant. It will never be exactly the same, that's clear, but we think that harmonization could help for these facilities to improve their performance. On the next slide, we highlight the possibilities. You know, these standards are taken in 91 are quite old, and on nitrogen, and particularly also on phosphorus, we think that better standards could be applied. So we have had a long discussion on to find new standards, and we have imposed new standards in the directive. They are quite ambitious for phosphorus, a little bit less for nitrogen, but at the same time, we had long discussion with the member states on nitrogen, because it's clear that higher standards for nitrogen would require for several facilities to rebuild them. And it was not our objective. We think that we need to push the standards on nitrogen at the maximum level, but by an optimization of the existing infrastructure, and a lot could be done there. So at the same time, the member states so far had the possibility to designate a sensitive area in which nitrogen and phosphorus should be treated. We have make that a little bit more limited. For instance, for all big facilities now, the nitrogen and phosphorus treatment will be compulsory. Big facilities starting by 150,000 equivalent inhabitants. So for all these facilities, the treatment will be compulsory. So for the smaller one, the risk-based approach would apply. So nitrogen and phosphorus would be imposed only where there is a risk for the environment. Similarly, we have imposed new treatment for micropollutants. What we see is that these pollutants are not treated for the time being in the wastewater treatment plant, and they pass through, and meaning there is an accumulation of micropollutant in the environment, which becomes really worrying. So there, similarly to tertiary treatment, we have imposed quaternary treatment for all big facilities without any discussion, but that will be spread on time. So member states will have until 2045 to make these investments progressively with interim targets. But at the same time, for the smaller facilities, we have applied also a risk-based approach. So between 10,000 equivalent inhabitants and 150, the treatment would be imposed where there is a risk for the environment. We have tried to calculate, at European level, where we think that there will be a risk, and around 70% of the facilities, according to our calculation, should be equipped between 10,000 and 150 PE. But that's a calculation that will be fine-tuned by the member states. To finance, and that's the next slides, and probably that's one of the originality and which has created a lot of discussion. So that's the next slide. We have proposed and we have managed to have a system of producer responsibility. In reality, for micropollutant, two sectors are mainly rejecting micropollutant, which is the pharmaceutical sector and the cosmetic sector. And at the end, after a long discussion between the Parliament and the Council, we managed to have an agreement that this additional treatment for micropollutants should be paid by the sector, by the polluters. And so at least 80% of these facilities, additional facilities, will be paid by the sector. This is not fantastically original, I must confess, because in solid waste management, it's the case already for several waste streams. The best example is packaging, and notably in Spain, but not only. Packaging are paid by the sector. So when big companies are using packaging and they are placing this packaging on the market, in fact, they are paying for the collection, the separate collection, and the recycling of their waste. So this is very similar to this system here. And it's the first time that it will be imposed in the water sector. And that will create additional funds to finance the quaternary treatment for the member states and for the wastewater treatment operator. On the next slide, we are discussing energy and greenhouse gas emission. Here, the Commission was hoping to come with a principle of progressive energy neutrality for all facilities. In fact, it is already the case in some countries, in one country, maybe two now, where all the wastewater treatment facilities are producing the energy they need. So they are in equilibrium. But we think that it's a best practice and that we should try to move towards this objective of zero energy. But after a long discussion, there was an agreement in the Council and the Parliament to have a derogation for those member states able to demonstrate that they are unable to reach this 100% energy neutrality, but they have to make audits and to show through these audits that reaching 100% is impossible. We think that in several instances it will be possible, so meaning that we hope that this derogation will not be used by several countries. On the greenhouse gas emission, for the time being, we have no objective, but all the measures that we have in the package should reduce the greenhouse gas emission by half by 2045. But it's clear that we will probably in the next review, we will have to tackle greenhouse gas emission. On the next slide, we are speaking about circular economy. We have taken different measures or pushing to take different measures to reduce pollution at source, so that sludge and water reuse will be possible in more instances. For instance, on water reuse also, we have taken some advanced measure allowing to not treat nitrogen and phosphorus when the water is reused in agriculture. There are a lot of conditions there, but it was a little bit seen as absurd to remove nitrogen and phosphorus from wastewater if the residues are used in agriculture where nitrogen and phosphorus is needed. So this is a kind of derogation which was introduced in the directive. But more importantly, also, we are really pushing and forcing member states to have an approach of measuring all the pollutants at the entry of the wastewater treatment plant and to have a measure to reduce this pollutant at source so that these pollutants are not accumulated in the sludge or in the water which could be reused. At the same time, we had long discussion, but we have the possibility for the Commission to develop a new objective, a new target for phosphorus recovery, and that we will do in implementing our delegated act in the 3 coming years. My before last slides, the next slide is on transparency and governance. Clearly, we have different measures to ensure that all operators are transparent of their main performance indicator, and that's quite important so that we are all paying in our water tariff for sanitation, and it's important to have transparency on how this money is used by each operator. There are also different health parameters that will be monitored now in the wastewater treatment plan, and that's a lesson from the COVID-19 crisis, where in fact we have found this virus in the wastewater sometimes 2 or 3 months before the actual pandemic. And the lessons from that is that information in wastewater on health parameter is fundamental and could avoid a lot of cost for the society later on. So it was a long discussion also with the member states and the parliament, but we managed to have to force a cooperation between the health authority and the wastewater authorities, and to track different pollutants and parameters, health parameters in the wastewater. Last but not least, we have also some measures which are mostly indicative and volunteer on access to sanitation. For us, it's important to the compulsory site is to identify those people not having access to sanitation. And then there are a lot of measures that member states are encouraged to take to improve access to sanitation. I still have 2 slides to go. I hope I'm not too long, but on the next slide, you will see that we were very serious on assessing what is the cost, what are the costs of this directive, this new directive, and it's about 3.8 billion per year. We made a calculation of the benefits of this revised directive, which are around 6.6 billion. But obviously, the costs are very concrete. So the benefits is a kind of macroeconomic calculation. It's benefit for society. So the costs are really to be paid by everybody. So we have tried also to imagine who will pay this 3.8 billion euro. And in fact, if we use the actual, the current strategy, around 70% of the costs are covered by water tariff in the member states, with differences between the member states, and 30% by public budget. If we project that in the future with this new directive, we arrive to the figures that are presented in these slides. Water tariffs are expected to increase by 2% on average in the European Union. We have calculated, what these 2% represent in terms of affordability and price of water for the less rich people, well, for the poor people. And the conclusion with the ECD was that affordability is not at risk in any member states. For public budget, the increase would be a little bit less than 1 billion per year. But in fact, it's to be compared to the 2 billion that the European Union is given every year to the member states. And last but not least, for the new producer responsibility, so pharmaceutical and cosmetic sector will have to pay 1.2 billion per year. In fact, this slide, it's not by 2040, it will be by 2045, because that's a site which was done before the negotiation. But you can see that during the negotiation, the member states managed to have 5 years more to implement all that. On my last slide, I would like to just finish by explaining what are the next steps with this directive. So we had the proposal for the Commission. We had the long discussion in the Council and the Parliament. I said long, but in fact, it was 1 year and a half. And now we have a text which is approved, but the final text needs to be reviewed by the jurist linguist, and that will be done by October. And then member states will have 30 months for the transposition of this directive. I would like to conclude by really heartily thank you for welcoming me, but also thanks the Spanish presidency, because while my colleague Irene Morantes is there, and she was really working with the whole team of the Spanish presidency during 6 months, like mad, to help us in the negotiation. And I really praise the work of the Spanish presidency, because they made the difference. They really managed to have a good agreement in the Council. In fact, the position of the Council was adopted under the Spanish presidency, and it was the most difficult step in the negotiation. So thanks again to the colleagues of the presidency of Spain. Really, it was really appreciated, their work, and we were working together really, really good, And I conclude with that. Thanks a lot for your attention.